morning. My name is Ed McMahon. I'm a senior resident fellow at the Urban Land Institute in Washington, D.C. For those of you who don't know what the Urban Land Institute is, we are an international nonprofit research and education organization devoted to fostering best practices in land use and development. And I'm going to talk about that today. Okay, so I think probably most of you here think Indiana is a pretty special place, and we've heard a lot about some of the ways to think about places today. I'm going to talk some more about those, but I want you to know that there is no place in the world today that will stay special by accident. And the reason, of course, is because the world is changing faster than ever. We just heard about changing our energy future as just one example. But one of the things I've learned in my 40 years in working in the urban planning world is that a lot of people don't like change. And that's particularly true in smaller communities and rural areas. People say, well, I just don't like change. But the truth is, there are only two kinds of change in the world we live in today. There's planned change and there's unplanned change. I mean, you can anticipate the changes that are coming, and you can prepare for them, and you can shape and direct them, or you can just let them happen. You can grow by chance, or you can grow by choice. You can accept the future you're given, or you can shape the future that you want. You know, Abraham Lincoln used to say that the best way to create the future was to predict it yourself. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about economic development. I'm going to talk about growth. And I'm going to talk about the quality of place and what I call the secrets of successful communities. Growth really is about choices. Should we put more development downtown or out on the highway? Should we grow more compactly or should we spread out? Should everything be a new building or should we restore, some of our existing buildings? It's also about our children. By the way, that's my son who is 41 years old now. But this is a conference that's really about this. It's about our children. It's about our grandchildren. It's about the future, and it's about preparing for the future. It's also about balance and harmony. We've also already heard a lot about that. It's about that relationship, if you will, between the built environment and the natural environment, between old and new, between jobs and the environment, between conservation and economic development. It's also about, I believe, finding win-win solutions to the problems that face us in America today. Like all the other speakers, I believe we spend way too much time in America fighting about what we disagree about, and not nearly enough time sitting down community by community to talk about what we do agree about. And when you do talk about what you agree about, you can actually change a community for the better. So you say, well, what is it that's changing? And the answer of that is, of course, everything is changing. I mean, the economy is changing, demographics, technology, consumer attitudes, market trends, healthcare, energy sources, transportation, options. The weather is changing. So, let's talk about employment. Yes, manufacturing is down in the United States, but business and professional services are up, and education and medicine are up even more. In 65 of the 100 biggest cities in America today, the largest employer is a hospital or a university. That's a change. And at least in recent years, a lot of the jobs we've lost in manufacturing have nothing to do with trade policy and everything to do with robotics and automation. You try going to a Walgreens today or a CVS and look how many fewer checkout people there are than there used to be. Just as one example, did you know that we've lost 89,000 people in the retail industry just since the first of the year in the United States? Since the first of the year. That's more people that are employed in the entire coal industry in the United States. And nobody's talking about that. But it has a lot to do with things like online shopping, for example. The world is changing. Some of you may have heard of a guy named Richard Florida. He wrote a book called The Creative Class. He has another book out called The Great Reset. He says how we live, work, shop, and move around is changing. And the communities that embrace the future are going to prosper, and that those do not will decline. There is a big sort going on in America. And, it used to be when I was a college student, we'd have these recruiters who would come and you'd get an interview, and then you might get offered a job, and you move to wherever they, offered that job to you. Today, as you've already heard, young people kind of figure out where they want to live first, and then they move there, and then they look for a job. And we're having a differentiation in America. So you go to a place like Austin, Texas, or Raleigh, North Carolina, or Washington D.C., et cetera, and like 50% of everybody has a college degree. But you go to West Virginia, it's 17%. You go to Las Vegas, it's 19%. Turns out people are clustering in the major metropolitan areas, in certain cooler, small cities and towns, and we'll talk some more about that later. So economic development, that's also about choices. Should you be spending all your money trying to recruit some new plant, factory, or distribution center, or should you be trying to look at the industries you've already got and figure out how to expand them and grow them? And when you think about business recruitment, you got to recognize that we got thousands of communities that are competing for a relative handful of new plants, factories, or distribution centers that we build anymore in America to do anything every year. So I want to tell you the economic development model has changed. So, when I was growing up, it was all about cheap land and cheap labor and cheap gas. And we thought that the rural economic development plan in the state of Alabama, where I grew up, was, let's just widen all the highways. And then we lined the highways with a bunch of junk. And we called that economic development. But I want to tell you something. It's not about shotgun recruitment anymore, elephant chasing. It's about laser recruitment. It's not about cheap labor. It's about highly trained talent. It's not about low-cost positioning. It's about high-value positioning. It's not about what you don't have. It's about what you do have. And I want to tell you, in the world we live in today, quality of life is critically important to our economic well-being. And I want to suggest to you that the most important infrastructure investment for a state like Indiana, it is not roads, it is education. Education. So let's talk some more about that. Many communities for many years, particularly in the Rust Belt, had this idea that economic development was always about the one big thing. So we had like an arms race to build the biggest convention center in America. And of course, most communities are never going to win that arms race. And then it was festival marketplaces. That worked fine in Baltimore and in Boston and a few other places. But did you know there were 19 other cities that built festival marketplaces that went bankrupt within 3 years? Like Toledo, Ohio, or Jacksonville, Florida, or Norfolk, Virginia, as a few examples. Then it was casinos and aquariums. So even a city like Camden, New Jersey said if they could just spend $100 million building an aquarium featuring the fish of New Jersey, that they could save Camden. Well, they did build that aquarium, and it is a very nice aquarium, but did it save Camden, New Jersey? No, it did not. And the reason for that is because successful economic today is rarely about the one big thing. It's much more frequently about lots of smaller things working synergistically together off of a plan that makes sense. You just heard a fantastic example of that from a rural area in Italy. Thinking small in a big way. And it turns out most new job creation in America are in small businesses. So you even go to the research triangle, and it turns out that the vast majority of companies in the largest high-tech plant complex in America are in small businesses. But what's so ironic is we give all of our subsidies and tax breaks to our big businesses. So let me just give you an example. This is a program called Grow New Jersey. And so what they've decided to do in New Jersey, and they've given away $3 billion to do what I'm about to tell you show you an example of. So Lockheed Martin had a facility in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And that facility, Cherry Hill, is 5 miles away from Camden, New Jersey. And so the Grow New Jersey program decided to give Lockheed Martin, one of the largest companies in the world, $105 million to move their facility into Camden, New Jersey. But it didn't employ a single person from Camden. All it did was move economic activity around. They surrounded that new building, which will pay no property taxes for 20 years, with a 500-car parking lot and a chain link fence. Does that help Camden? Does that help New Jersey? It's simply moving economic activity around. So think about if you had a choice, what makes more sense in economic development? Subsidies and tax breaks that simply pit one community against another. Businesses threaten to leave, or if they're I'll get a better deal. Mobile, Alabama built a cruise ship terminal on their riverfront. The river being probably their most important asset, getting to the water. And they didn't have a cruise ship until they built it. It cost them $80 million for a 4-block-long gray concrete parking garage, essentially. And Carnival Cruise Line came, and they stayed 1 year until they got a better deal from New Orleans, and they moved away. Or maybe we could think about spending some of that same money in creating lasting assets that will pay dividends long into the future. You could think about helping existing businesses. You could think about retraining workers for the jobs that we've got vacancies in all over the country. Which one of those would have a more long-lasting impact? Let's talk about quality of life and economic development. So this is a guy, you've probably never heard of him. His name is Foster Fries. He runs a mutual fund company called the Brandywine Investment Group, and he's very active in Republican Party politics. He was Rick Santorum's #1 campaign contributor in 2012. But anyway, this company was headquartered in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania for about 40 years. That's a busy suburb of Philadelphia. But this guy, he likes to fly fish. So every summer, he would fly out to Jackson, Wyoming to go fly fishing. And then you know what happens? One day he's stuck in traffic on the Schuylkill Expressway, and all of a sudden a light bulb goes on in his mind, and he says, hey, I can run a mutual fund company anywhere on the planet. So he picks up his entire company and moves it into downtown Jackson, Wyoming. That's the largest private sector employer in Jackson today. Why is he there? Access to outdoor recreation. Who would have thought that that was an economic development driver? But it is. There's so many things have changed. So I want to leave you with this idea that there are some key fundamentals in economic development today. First is talent. Thinking about how to attract and retain smart people. You heard an example from Italy where they were thinking about they're losing population, they're losing their young people. What could we do to help people want to stay here, to help bring people back? So thinking about all the ways to attract and retain people. Innovation, the ability to generate new ideas and turn them into commercial realities. Connectivity, creating places where people and ideas can easily connect. So like a co-working space or an incubator space or a downtown, for example, is a place where people and ideas can easily connect. But one of the things that often gets left off this list is the thing at the bottom, the distinctiveness of place, the quality of place, the unique characteristics that set you apart. Ladies and gentlemen, successful communities are distinctive communities. Austin has this slogan, keep Austin weird. It's kind of a funny slogan. But they don't think it's just a funny slogan. They think it's an economic development imperative. And what it means is keep Austin different, keep them special, keep them on the cutting edge. We're a place of innovation and creativity, and they are now the fastest growing city in America, ladies and gentlemen. Distinctiveness has great value. The World Bank has this new publication out called The Economics of Uniqueness, and they make the same point in 300 pages many different ways. They say if you cannot differentiate Richmond, Indiana from any other community in the world we live in today, you will simply have no competitive advantage. Sameness is not a plus in the world we live in today. Sameness is a minus. Joe Courtwright, who runs a group called CEOs for Cities, he put it this way. He said, the unique characteristics of a place may be the only truly defensible source of competitive advantages for cities and towns. Mark Twain, said we take stock of a city like we take stock of a man. The clothes or appearance are the externals by which we judge. Let's talk about a community's front door, its gateway, and just like with meeting a person, a good first impression is important, and a bad first impression is hard to change. Do you think you'd rather visit the town of Franklin, Tennessee, Or would you rather go to the town of Midfield, Alabama? Which one looks more like a community with a sense of pride and a sense of place? Which one looks more like a community that you would rather invest time or money in? If you don't remember anything else I say this morning, remember this. The image of a community is fundamentally important to its economic well-being. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that every single day in the world, people make decisions about where to live, where to invest, where to vacation, where to retire, based on what our communities look like, what they look like. Let me show you a couple of examples. Let's talk about tourism. And tourism is sort of important because it is the biggest industry in the world. It is the first, second, or third largest industry in every single American state. So this is the official travel guide for the state of Oregon. Note their slogan, Oregon, things look different here. Can you imagine a state travel brochure that said something like, Indiana, things look the same here? Well, of course not, because who'd want to come? What is travel? Travel is about visiting places that are different, unusual, and unique. The more Richmond, Indiana comes to look just like every other place in America, the less reason there is to come here. On the other hand, the more you do to enhance your uniqueness, whether it's architectural, historic, cultural, artistic, whatever, the more people want to come, because that's exactly what tourism is. If every place was just like every place else, there'd simply be no reason to travel any place. So, think about the economy and place. In the old economy, it was all about markets. In the new economy, it's about places. Steve McKnight, who works in Pittsburgh, that's one of the top economic development firms in the country, he says new investment is increasingly seeking locations based on the quality of place rather than the utility of the location. The National Association of Realtors, NARs, they say the place is becoming more important than the product. And what they mean by that is what's going on outside of a house, for example, is more important than what's going on inside of a house. The character of a neighborhood is more important than the size of the lot. And Mick Cornett, who's the head of the Republican Mayors Association, he says, he's the mayor of Oklahoma City, he says economic development is really the result of creating places that people want to be. Creating places that people want to be. All right, so let's think about some dimensions of distinctiveness, some dimensions of uniqueness. And I just want to touch on each of these briefly. So let's talk about anchor institutions like Earlham College or Indiana University, or maybe the hospital. Anchor institutions can really drive the economy of place, but some do and some don't. Some get involved with communities, some don't. Who are the two biggest recipients of federal research dollars in the United States? I'll tell you who they are. Number one, Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore gets about $2 billion a year in federal research dollars. Number two, Stanford University. So Stanford has figured out how to commercialize the research that they produce, and they've created the Silicon Valley. It's one of the greatest job generators in the history of the world. On the other hand, Johns Hopkins didn't really care what was going on in Baltimore, and all of their research was focused inward, and they didn't care about that city, not until recently. And as a result, Baltimore is still a very struggling city, despite the fact that the largest employer in the state of Maryland is the Johns Hopkins University. But now they have a new president. He's kind of figured this out. They've now investing billions of dollars into the neighborhood around them. And they're now trying to think of themselves not just as a university in a city, but part of a larger ecosystem that will make a city a good or bad place to live. Let's talk about downtowns. Downtowns are important, ladies and gentlemen, because if you don't have they're the heart and soul of any community. If you don't have a healthy downtown, you simply don't have a healthy town. The apple rots from the inside out. We haven't figured anything else out in the urban planning world. We figured out that it's kind of hard to be a suburb of nothing. So when you invest in bringing a downtown back to life, you're really investing in the entire community, because it is the first thing that somebody looks at when they're thinking about moving to a community or investing in a community. This is a magazine for economic development people and for office park developers. Note this headline: when site searching the South, make sure you inspect a community's downtown first. Well, why would an industrial park developer care about a downtown? Because they know it says so much about the health of the entire community. And by the way, big companies are moving back downtown. This is a new study by Cushman Wakefield. Reports that 500 major American companies have moved from suburban office locations back into downtown in just the past 5 years. Companies like Motorola and Marriott and McDonald's and Caterpillar and General Electric, and I could go on and on and on. And why are they moving? To attract and retain talented workers, to build brand identity, support creative collaboration, etc. Let me give you an example. So Amazon used to be spread all over the Seattle region, but they decided to move downtown into 2 restored historic buildings and 9 new buildings. Used to be there was only one way if you were an employee of Amazon to get to Amazon, that was to drive your car. Well, you can drive your car to the new headquarters, but you can also now take a train, you can take a bus, you can take the ferry, you can ride your bike, you can even walk, because it's right in the middle of the city. And, you know, when you get off work, you're in the middle of it all. So that's kind of good for that city. Let me show you a small city example. Here's a city almost exactly the same size as Richmond, Frederick, Maryland. This was a city that was dying and going no place. They had a terrible flood in the early 1990s, and they didn't have anybody living downtown. But they had a creative mayor who had gone down to San Antonio and seen the San Antonio Riverwalk, and he said, you know, I think we could do that in our town. Build a small town version of the San Antonio Riverwalk. People said, oh no, you can't do that. It costs too much. Won't work, etc., etc. But he built it, both as a flood control project and as a new public park. And the $11 million he spent on that little Riverwalk within about 5 years had generated $400 million in new investment directly adjacent to it. Today, this small city of less than 40,000 people has 5,000 people living in the downtown. It has 800 downtown businesses, 200 retailers and restaurants, 25 small high-tech companies. And they've now extended that Riverwalk by a whole mile because it's had such a huge impact on bringing this small city back to life. Let's talk about historic buildings. Another beautiful neighborhood today. Got to go ride around a little bit last night and look at some of the buildings here in town. So why is it important to think about historic buildings and neighborhoods and landscapes? Well, let me show you a little example. Some of you probably have read or at least heard of Thomas Wolfe, and he's a famous author. He's the guy that penned the immortal line, "You can't go home again." Well, sadly, he can't go home again because here's the site of his original house in this parking lot in Asheville, North Carolina. So why are historic buildings important? I would suggest to you first and foremost, because these are the places that physically connect us to the past. These are the places that tell us who we are and where we came from. You know, a city without a past is really like a man without a memory. You know, as Daniel Webster once wrote, he said, quote, "The man who feels no sentiment or veneration for the memory of his forefathers is himself unworthy of kindred regard and remembrance." At its essence, saving the historic buildings of Indiana is about saving the heart and soul of Indiana. But it's also incredibly important to your economic well-being as well. Let me show you a few examples. I am the chairman of the board of the National Main Street Center, which works in thousands of communities around the United States. And this is one of the very first communities we worked in, Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin. And that used to be the fire station in Sheboygan Falls, and then, you know, it became obsolete for that purpose, and the guy bought it and turned it into a pizza parlor. But like so many small towns, this was a town going downhill until they brought in the Main Street program, a very powerful tool for economic revitalization. They started working with the owners of downtown businesses to restore their facades, physically connecting people to their roots in the past. Tells a story about the history of the building. But guess what else happened? Well, sales of pizza almost doubled, and they sustained that over a multi-year period. So let me show you a couple of nationally famous examples. Of course, I could go through lots of these different studies. But let's go down to New Orleans, where I've spent a lot of time, because I was one of the people brought down there by the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana after Katrina, asked to put together a redevelopment plan for the city, spent many months there. And one of the things we asked them, all the consultants who they brought in after the storm, you know, they didn't want just a physical redevelopment plan, they wanted an economic redevelopment plan. So we, of course, said, well, what are your biggest industries? Is it the seafood industry, the sugar industry, the oil industry, the chemical industry? Said, no, the single biggest industry in the state of Louisiana is the tourism industry, number one. What is the engine of that industry? Well, you're looking at it. It's called the French Quarter and all the other historic neighborhoods in New Orleans. But did you know that for about 40 years, the state of Louisiana wanted to put a freeway right through the middle of the French Quarter? Ladies and gentlemen, that is more important and more valuable than any plant, factory, or distribution center in the entire state of Louisiana. But people just didn't understand that. Well, let me give you another example. Let's go over to Texas and visit the San Antonio Riverwalk. That's the #1 destination in the entire state of Texas. It's the basis of that city's multi-billion-dollar a year annual tourism industry, and it's the single defining characteristic of that city. What most people don't know, however, is that at one point in the past, the city of San Antonio thought so little of that small river, they actually tried to put it underground into a culvert. Today, it's the most visited place in all of Texas. Let's go out to Seattle and visit the Pike Place Farmers Market, the #1 destination in the state of Washington. 8 million visitors a year. You know, but once again, about 30 years ago, there were some people on the Seattle City Council who seriously proposed tearing this down. And why did they propose tearing it down? They said, oh, well, we need more downtown parking. Like parking for what? You can have all the parking in the world. If there's nothing to do, nobody's going to want to go there. You know, if you have a parking problem, that really means you're successful. So think about, you know, saving the buildings that people might want to park to go to as probably a more important strategy. Let's go to Florida. What's the #1 destination in Florida? Disney World. What's #2? Well, there it is until they get cleaned up after the hurricane. It's called the Art Deco Historic District in South Miami Beach. The largest collection of Art Deco buildings in North America, and they were all going to be torn down. But now people literally come from all over the world to visit this place. Let's talk about the baseball stadiums. Here's the Camden Yards Baseball Stadium, probably the most influential sports stadium ever built in North America, not just because it was a new stadium, but because it was the first of the so-called retro stadiums. Did the best job of integrating new construction with the historic buildings and neighborhoods that surrounded that site. You know, they saved the old warehouse, Camden Yards Warehouse. It was a train warehouse. And then guess what? The field is 16 feet below the street level. And why is that? Well, they didn't want the stadium to tower over the row houses that surround the stadium. It was a good neighbor. Well, there's a concept. Maybe have new fitting in with old. Turns out it worked pretty well from an economic standpoint. And I think if you think about just tourism, Arthur Fromer summed up pretty well. He said, among cities and towns with no particular recreational appeal, those that preserve their past continue to enjoy tourism. Those that haven't receive almost no tourism at all. Tourists simply won't go to a city or town that's lost its soul. But, you know, as I said before, there's lots of other things going on here. I mentioned Main Street. Well, pound for pound and dollar for dollar, this is probably the most successful economic program in American history. We're not giving away billions of dollars. We're basically bottoms-up economic development. And, you know, if you want to see something that works without giving away the store, think about working on this. So let's talk about some of the changes. You know, we've been talking about preservation for a long time, but I think there's a new awareness among the development community about the value of preservation. So we do a report at the Urban Land Institute every year called Emerging Trends in Real Estate. And 2 years ago, our research found that restored industrial buildings, like old warehouses, were commanding higher rents nationwide than new Class A office space. I want to repeat that. Restored industrial buildings were commanding higher rents than new Class A office space. You say, well, how is that possible? I'll tell you how it's possible. because particularly creative class employers like buildings with character, as opposed to just a glass box. And it turns out that these old warehouse buildings and things like this, you can move things around very easily, and there's a need for flexibility in the kind of companies that we have today. So here's one example. Here's an old derelict wharf building in Boston. Guess what? It's now the world headquarters for the Converse shoe company. Let's talk about hotels. Did you know that when we interview millennials, they tell us that authenticity and interesting are more important than comfortable and predictable in lodging facilities. And the hotel chains are listening to this, and as a result, they're doing two things. Number one, they're restoring historic buildings at a rate they had never, ever considered before. This year, 25% of the new Marriotts in the United States will be in restored historic buildings. And they're moving them back downtown because it turns out, I couldn't stay in downtown Richmond. I'm out on the highway. And I would love to be in the downtown, but you don't have a downtown hotel. And I want to tell you, there's a lot more people besides me who would love to stay in a downtown where they could walk to something. The only thing I could walk to was a gas station and a Burger King. So let me just show you a few examples. So this is in Covington, Kentucky, where they turned the old department store into a new hotel. And here's in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where they turned the old cork factory into a new hotel. And here's in Portland, Oregon, where they turned the elementary school into a hotel. And it's interesting, there's a company in the West Coast called McMinimums, and their slogan is, shouldn't a hotel reflect a city and not each other? And so every one of their hotels is in a restored historic building that's reflective of the community that it is found in. Let's talk about parks and green space for a second. Yep, there's lots of studies, hundreds of studies, in fact, that show that parks and green spaces increases the value of adjacent property. You just go to Millennium Park in Chicago to see an example of that. Thousands of new units of housing, millions of tourists, billions of dollars of increased assessed valuation all around that park. But let me show you a small town example. So I flew to Southwest Texas 3 years ago to photograph courthouse squares. And I went to this little town, Sulphur Springs, Texas. They had a lovely courthouse, which I had heard about. But of course, there was nothing going on downtown, certainly nothing going on the courthouse square. Once a year at 4th of July, they had a little ceremony there. But if you go there today, things have changed quite dramatically. They put a splash pad down right on the front of the courtyard. And now there are 300 events a year downtown, 300 events a year. They've got weddings and concerts and movies, the farmers markets, bike rallies, festivals, relays, fun runs, Christmas activities, birthday parties, etc. And guess what? The whole courthouse square has come back to life because everybody's downtown every day doing something. And when the kids are downtown, everybody else comes downtown, and they were just voted the most improved small town in the state of Texas. Let's talk about how retail is changing. Here's the old model, strip mall coming soon. But I want to tell you that model is a model for the last century. The future belongs to downtowns and main streets and mixed-use development. And why is that? Well, there's lots of reasons. One is called the internet. Another is because we overbuilt out on the highway. A third is because all that junk out on the highway is so ugly and congested. Can you imagine running a successful marketing campaign around that slogan, hey, shop here, we're both ugly and congested, come on down. Well, that's completely unsustainable, particularly if you have an alternative to it. So, we've gone from 4 square feet of retail space in America to over 40. And if we didn't learn anything else in the recession, we learned we were overstored out on the highway. And so now the International Council of Shopping Centers tells us we're under-demolished, basically. And so, and the reason was because before the recession, we were building retail space in America 5 times faster than retail sales. So, the Walmart would open, and then the Ames would go out of business, and then something else would go out of business, and then they'd close the Walmart and open a super Walmart, and then they'd have 3 cities with no Walmart and no downtown because they'd already killed the downtown. And so, yes, our love affair with the malls is changing, and the really big reason is because our consumer attitudes are changing. And, you know, this is a front page story from USA Today, and basically it's about the fact that the average amount of time that an American spends in a mall or a strip shopping center has been going down for years. People go to buy what they want and they leave. That's it. All the stores are exactly the same. So guess what? We haven't built any new malls since 2006. We've torn down 300 existing malls. There's a great website called deadmalls.com. Go on it. You can go on it tonight, and you can look at Indiana. You can click on Indiana and get a list of all the dead and dying malls in the state of Indiana. And, you know, the remaining malls, yeah, some of them are doing quite well, but most of them are being turned inside out. They're not about retail anymore. It's about mixing uses. And show you an example. So this is the county I live in, Montgomery County, Maryland. It's the biggest county in the state of Maryland. We've got about 1.5 million people. And our county seat was Rockville. And in 1970, they decided it was a really brilliant idea to just tear the entire downtown down and to replace it with this lovely mall you see here in the background. But guess what? Now they tore the mall down, put the downtown back. And it's kind of a metaphor for America, and it's going on all over the country that this is happening. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is our new promised land. You know, remember Joni Mitchell's song about you tear up paradise and you put in a parking lot? Well, our greatest redevelopment opportunities is to tear up our parking lots and put paradise back together. These are large, flat, well-drained sites. We already got the infrastructure out front. These places are underperforming, and they're the easiest place to put density without messing around with any single-family neighborhood. So we have an oversupply of large lot single-family houses in almost every market in America, and an undersupply of everything else, like apartments or senior housing or small lot housing or cottages or attached housing. Did you know that the majority of all housing being built in a number of major cities in the United States is being built now on commercially zoned land along strips like that, turned into places? So, you know, here's the alternative. So, you know, Best Buy's one, it's all by itself. You got to get in the car to drive there. It's spread out, single use. Let me show you another one. Here's the Best Buy in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. And I understand that all of you don't want to sleep upstairs and shop downstairs, but there are a lot of people who do like that idea, like maybe some of the 75% of American households who have no school-age children or single people living alone. That's the fastest growing household form in America, single people living by themselves. You say, well, we couldn't do that in Richmond. Well, maybe you could do something like this. Here's a brand new Dairy Queen in a small town of Herndon, Virginia. It has a dentist office upstairs. How appropriate. You know, the retailers have thrown out all the rules, and the reason they've thrown out all the rules is because there's only one place left in America with more spending power than stores, and that is in our downtowns. And so all of the retailers want to go back in our downtowns, and to do that, they're building mixed-use projects, small footprint, multi-story buildings, restoring historic buildings and putting in grocery stores in there. So here's the old Walmart. And for years, they just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but now they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. That's the first Walmart ever built in Washington, D.C. It's in a 5-story brand new building. There are 200 apartments above the Walmart. There's a swimming pool on the roof. You say, where's the parking? The parking is under the building, and they don't need as much parking because it's in a city, and a lot of people take public transportation there, or they walk there, or they ride a bike there. And by the way, this is the first Walmart in America that actually has real windows that let in real sunlight onto the floor of the Walmart. Well, that's a first, but guess what? This is now happening all over the place. So here's a Target in Minneapolis, and here's a Target in Portland. You know, Target's buying up all the old department stores and restoring them. The Carson Prairie Scott Building, downtown Chicago, National Historic Landmark. It's the new Target. How about the Home Depot? You know, somebody said to me, well, how do you get your lumber home? Well, they deliver. You know, you say you couldn't do it in a small town. Yes, you can. Here's the new Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas. It's 1 block off the main square. There's no parking in front of it. Walmart is now spending hundreds of millions of dollars to turn Bentonville into a walkable, pedestrian-friendly community because they couldn't get people to move to Bentonville to work for Walmart. Did you know that the Walmart World Headquarters is in 8 metal Butler buildings with no windows? So yeah, they're going to tear those all down and build a downtown building for their new headquarters. So, let me show you how the economics of this works. So I was in Bentonville, meeting with the Walton Family Foundation, and then we drove down to Fayetteville. We're coming down the interstate highway, and I saw this Waffle House off the interstate highway. And, I've seen lots of Waffle Houses before, so I wasn't really paying any attention to that until I got into downtown Fayetteville, and I saw this other Waffle House in a brand new 4-story building with 3 floors of housing above the Waffle House. And I said, well, that's kind of interesting. I've never seen a mixed-use Waffle House before. So I said, I thought maybe I'd go over to the city hall and see if I could find the city planner and find out about this Waffle House. And I went over there. It turns out they've already done a study on this Waffle House. And it turns out that the downtown Waffle House is selling more waffles than the one out on the highway. But more importantly, it's generating more taxes per acre, more jobs per acre. It has more residents per acre. Nobody lives above the Waffle House out on the highway, but 42 people live upstairs above the Waffle House in downtown Fayetteville. And oh, by the way, if you're eating a lot of waffles, you probably need to walk after you go there. So it's actually good for health as well. And ladies and gentlemen, this is why the future belongs to mixed-use development, because economically it's outperforming in every single way you can measure economic performance all the things out on the highway. And it has something else going on, something in the real estate world we call the place-making dividend. And that simply means this: people stay longer, come back more often, and spend more money in places that attract their affection. Places that attract their affection. All right, I want to end by sharing with you what I call my secrets of successful communities. I've worked in probably 700 or 800 cities in all 50 states over a period of about 40 years, and I've come to some conclusions about why some communities are doing very, very well and other communities are not doing so well. And first and foremost, I think it always begins with a vision for the future, a shared vision for the future. And how do those visions begin? They begin by inventorying your assets. And then successful communities build all their plans, whether it's a land use plan, an economic development plan, a tourism plan, whatever, around the enhancement of what you already have. And obviously some places have more things than other places, but it all begins by thinking carefully about what your assets are. And then successful communities use education, they use incentives, they use partnerships, they use voluntary initiatives, not just regulation. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we don't need any regulations. They prevent bad things from happening. They set a minimum standard of conduct, but I would suggest to you we need to use carrots, not just sticks. How do we make it easier to get development in the places that we want it, and perhaps harder in the places that we don't want it? Successful communities pick and choose. All development is not created equal, ladies and gentlemen. The biggest impediment that I have seen in small cities in America to better development is a fear of saying no to anything. Well, if you are afraid to say no to anything, you will get the worst of everything. Communities that set low standards or no standards are simply going to compete to the bottom. Communities that set high standards compete to the top. Because they know if you say no to bad development, you will always get better development in its place. Successful communities cooperate with their neighbors for mutual benefit. Successful communities consider what they look like. Successful communities have strong leaders and committed citizens. So let me just show you a couple of communities that are exemplary of what I've just talked about. Welcome to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Used to be called a patch of rust in the Sun Belt. And it was known as the most polluted city in America. But nobody makes fun of Chattanooga anymore. It is now known as an international model for community revitalization. And it all began with an inventory of their assets. And they decided to focus on two big things. One, downtown, because that's the heart and soul of any community. And two, the Tennessee River, because that was their most important natural asset. And then when they started, all of downtown Chattanooga used to look like that. It was just one empty, boarded up building after another. And, you know, they didn't pick the biggest project first, they picked the smallest project first because they realized that nothing succeeds like success. So they restored that building. And people said, hey, that's pretty cool, how'd you do that? And then they did bigger projects, and finally they started doing things like this. This is the Outlet Mall in Chattanooga. It's not out on the highway somewhere. It's in old restored warehouse buildings right in downtown Chattanooga. This is the Tennessee River Gorge. It's 15 minutes from downtown Chattanooga. It led to the founding of the first land trust in the South, the Tennessee River Gorge Trust. All of that land is now preserved. And the owners of that land saved their view and got a tax break too. A voluntary initiative. And then they said, well, why don't we build a trail all along the Tennessee River, both sides? And when they first proposed this in 1975, the projected price tag was $15 million, and that's a lot of money for a small city. But Chattanooga realized something extremely important, and that is that how much something costs is not the most important question. It is the second most important question. What is the most important question facing any community? It's what should we do? What should we do? And as I said before, money follows good ideas, especially if those ideas come out of a consensus building process. And they built that trail, and that $15 million investment led to over $1 billion in private investment adjacent to that trail. And because they had a vision for the future, they were able to do some pretty remarkable things. This is the Walnut Street Bridge, an obsolete highway bridge. Tennessee DOT had set aside $4 million for its demolition. But Chattanooga said, no, we got a better idea. Give us that same amount of money, we'll turn it into the nation's longest pedestrian bridge. It now connects one side of the Tennessee River with the other. Let me show you a small town example. Welcome to Susan City, California. In 1980, it was voted the worst place to live in Northern California. Kind of not a surprise, given that's its city hall. It was in 2 double-wide trailers. This was the only city hall in California that had registered the Department of Motor Vehicles. But you know, public buildings are kind of important, and they used to always be our most beautiful buildings. Whether it was the courthouse, the library, the public school, you name it, and they were almost always in the middle of our towns. And then, you know, starting about 1960, what we decided cheaper was better. And you know what we've learned from that experience? We've learned that cheaper is simply cheaper. And so you know what they said to themselves in Susan City? They said, why would anybody invest in a community that wouldn't invest in itself? So they built a new city hall right on that same spot. And that began the decade-long turnaround in that city. And by 1995, they were voted one of the best places to live in Northern California, but it all began with an investment in themselves. Let me show you another example. This is the gateway to the Parris Island Marine Corps Base, Port Royal, South Carolina. It was a funky little town going no place. And this was their city hall. But guess what? They tore that building down and replaced it with this building. And they couldn't afford the whole building, so they leased part of the building to the private sector. So the public sector's on one floor, the private sector's on the other floor. But that building caught the attention of a builder who found a piece of land right on the edge of town. He decided to extend the street grid in there. He didn't put a bunch of cul-de-sacs in there. He just put the grids in, put blocks in there. And then he went to a local architect and said, could you design some new houses for me that look like old South Carolina houses? He said, yeah, we could do that. They built 41 new houses. And these houses changed this town forever, for the better. And all of a sudden, people started moving back into town, 41 families, and everything started to change because of these 41 new families living in this community right next to the downtown. So they started to look at all the downtown buildings, which used to all be empty and vacant and boarded up, and one by one they started restoring them. And then the elementary school said, well, we're too small now, we got to go out to the highway. But they have 41 new families living in town. They say, no, don't do that. Why don't you put an addition on the back of the school and then all the kids can walk? Oh, didn't think of that. So they built this new addition right in downtown, and all the kids are walking to school again. And then the post office said, well, the town's growing now. We got to leave. We got to go out to the highway too. And they said, no, you don't. We'll find you another site, a bigger site, and you're going to build us a beautiful neoclassical post office when you do that, because the post office is a community gathering place and it needs to be in the downtown, not out on the highway. Inventory your assets: natural, cultural, human, economic, educational, recreational, environmental, whatever. Sometimes the assets of the community are very obvious: world-class scenery, unparalleled wildlife resources, or unbelievable architectural legacy. That's Annapolis, by the way. Sometimes the assets are not very obvious. Welcome to Lowell, Massachusetts. 1975, it was a dying industrial city. It had an unemployment rate of 28%. It didn't think it had any assets, but what it had was abandoned textile mills, and it had a vision, and it had strong leadership, and they have restored all of those mills, and they have turned this into the Charleston, South Carolina of New England. This is a place that has used old mills for everything from luxury condominiums to affordable housing to restaurants to the new University of Massachusetts at Lowell in old restored warehouses. So this is a torpedo factory, a real torpedo factory in Alexandria, Virginia. Now the most successful arts center in America, 200 working artists, 2 million visitors a year. You know, adversity can breed opportunity. In Columbus, Georgia had a terrible flood. They said, when we build back, we want to build back better. So they built one of the great river walks in American history, and it turned their downtown around. Or Paducah, which turned their flood walls into art galleries. Or, you know, Rapid City, which realized that, you know, having a big parking lot on the main street was maybe not as important as having a park on the main street, that brought the downtown back to life. Or how about Akron, when they, you know, was the headquarters for the Quaker Oats Company, decided not to tear down their grain elevators, but to turn them into the Hilton Hotel as part of the Quaker Oats redevelopment. Or how about Poughkeepsie, New York, probably the most challenged town in upstate New York, has a bridge, the highest bridge in the state of New York, 275 feet above the Hudson River, obsolete, closed, but what have they done? They've turned into a state park that now gets 800,000 visitors a year. In a small town, no one was visiting until they did that. Successful community education, incentives, partnerships, and volunteer initiatives. Why do we educate? In order to reduce the need to regulate. Why do we educate? Because people won't embrace what they don't understand. Why do we educate? Because you have a right to choose your future, but also to know what the choices are. So yes, we should use incentives, and there's lots of incentives in addition to free Cokes. How about historic preservation tax credits, which allowed this empty brewery to be turned into this great museum of art? Or how about down in Yazoo City, where they just heard about a little program that the Irish started called the Tidy Towns program, and they just started passing out free paint, and they painted their way back to vibrancy. You know, successful communities pick and choose about development proposals. They have hometown heroes, people like you willing to work to see that whatever your vision is gets implemented. And I know it is not always easy getting things done in small cities in America. And I can tell you that no is a powerful word in American communities. But I want to tell you a more powerful word, yes. Yes, we can make Richmond a better place to live in, to look at, to work in, to visit. You know, ladies and gentlemen, you can grow without destroying the things that people love. You know, you have the future in your hands. And if you don't care who gets the credit, you can get an awful lot done. I love this quote from Monty Python's movie, The Life of Brian. He says, apart from sanitation, medicine, education, wine, public order, roads, irrigation, public health, and a freshwater system, what have the Romans ever done for us? Ladies and gentlemen, a vision is important, but implementation is priceless. Thank you so much for having me here this morning.